A billionaire sat alone on Father's Day, convinced he had already lost his daughter forever. Then a hungry 6-year-old girl approached him with a crumpled drawing and one heartbreaking sentence: "I don't have a dad." What happened next would change both of their lives in ways neither expected. The wooden bench felt like winter trapped in wood, seeping through Silas Mercer's expensive coat, like the city wanted him to pay for every later he'd ever said. Lincoln Park was loud with joy, fathers hoisting kids onto their shoulders, toddlers sprinting with bright balloons, couples taking photos beneath trees that were just starting to green again. Father's Day had turned the whole park into a living postcard, and Silas sat in the corner of it like a man who didn't belong in the picture. His phone rested in his pocket, heavy as a stone. He didn't need to pull it out to know what he'd find: nothing. No call, no message, no shaky little voice saying, "Happy Father's Day, Dad." 3 months ago, his daughter Maeve, 9 years old, stubborn like her mother, sharp like a blade, had stood in the doorway with a backpack on and tears she refused to let fall. "You never have time for me anyway, Dad," she'd said, and the slam of the door afterward had echoed in Silas's head ever since. He'd built a company that made headlines, signed deals that made rooms stand up when he entered, bought a Gold Coast townhouse so quiet it could swallow sound. At 41, he could purchase almost anything with a swipe or a signature, but none of it could buy back a bedtime story he'd skipped or a bike lesson he'd postponed. Across the path, a father jogged beside a wobbling little bike hands, hovering close without touching, letting the boy believe he was flying on his own. The kid tipped, bumped the grass, cried for a heartbeat, then laughed when his dad scooped him up like the fall was part of the fun. Silas's throat tightened. He had promised Maeve he'd teach her to ride. He had promised it so many times it stopped sounding like love and started sounding like an excuse. He dragged a hand down his face, fighting the sting behind his eyes. And that was when a small shadow halted in front of his knees, and a careful child's voice said. Silas lowered his hand and looked up. The little girl standing in front of him couldn't have been older than 6. Messy blonde hair clung to her forehead in uneven strands, and her oversized blue eyes seemed too serious for such a small face. Her clothes were worn and dusty, the sleeves slightly too long, as if they once belonged to someone bigger. But what held Silas's attention wasn't the dirt or the torn edges of her shoes. It was the way she held a stepped closer, her movements, careful, stepped closer. Her movements careful, almost shy. She extended the wrinkled paper toward him. "I made this with my heart," she said. Then she added in the same simple tone someone might use to say the sky was blue, "I don't have a daddy." The words struck Silas like a sudden wind. He accepted the paper slowly, afraid his hands might shake. It was a drawing made with a red crayon. A big, uneven heart filled most of the page, and around it were lines that might have been hair or sunshine. In the corner, written in crooked, uncertain letters, was one word: Dad. Some letters were backwards, others were barely letters at all. But the meaning was painfully clear. Silas stared at it longer than he meant to. The girl shifted her weight, worry flickering across her face. "Is it bad?" she asked quietly. Silas blinked and shook his head. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "No, it's beautiful." Relief spread across her small face, and before he could stop himself, the truth slipped out of him like a confession. "My daughter left," Silas said. The girl tilted her head, curious. "Why?" The single word opened a door he had been trying desperately to keep shut. Silas didn't answer right away. The word "why" hung in the air between them like a question too big for the quiet park bench. Around them, Father's Day laughter still drifted through the trees, children calling for their dads, bicycles rattling over the path, balloons bouncing gently in the wind. But for a moment, it felt like the whole park had gone silent. Silas stared down at the drawing again, at the crooked red heart and the uncertain word "Dad," and felt the weight of every promise he had broken. Because he began slowly, then stopped. How could he explain to a 6-year-old that success could also mean failure? That he had spent years chasing meetings, flights, and deadlines, while the most important person in his life waited by the door for him to come home. He rubbed his hands together, searching for a simpler truth. Because I didn't know how to be a good dad, he finally admitted. The girl nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Oh. She climbed onto the bench beside him with a small grunt, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the ground. Up close, Silas noticed how worn her sneakers were, once white, now gray and tired. One of her socks had a tiny hole near the toe. Something tightened painfully in his chest. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Junie," she replied, brushing hair from her eyes. "Junie Hart." She said the last name quickly, like it didn't belong anywhere. "And you, Silas?" he said. She repeated it slowly, tasting the syllables. "Silas." Then she smiled. Silas studied her face, suddenly aware of how unusual this moment was. A child this young shouldn't be sitting alone in a city park. "Junie," he said carefully. "You said you don't have a dad. Where's your mom?" Junie's smile faded just a little. She looked down at her hands and spoke in a quiet voice. "She went to heaven." Silas felt his stomach twist. The calm way she said it frightened him more than tears would have. "How long ago?" he asked softly. Junie shrugged. "Since it started getting cold." Silas felt the air leave his lungs. The way Junie said it, calm, almost casual, made the words heavier, not lighter. A child shouldn't be able to talk about losing her mother like it was a small detail in a story. He leaned forward slightly, trying to keep his voice gentle so he wouldn't scare her. "Junie. Who takes care of you now?" Junie shrugged again, the movement small and practiced. "Just me." She swung her feet slowly above the ground, watching the path ahead of them as people passed by without noticing her. "Some nights I sleep on those long benches over there," she added, pointing toward the far side of the park. "Sometimes under the bridge when it rains. It doesn't get wet there." Silas followed her finger, his chest tightening. Junie continued as if she were describing ordinary places in a neighborhood. "Yesterday I slept in a church. The door was open and it was warm." Silas's heart pounded in his ears. A 6-year-old shouldn't know which benches were safest to sleep on. He looked at her again. Really looked at the thinness of her arms, the dirt on her sleeves, the quiet exhaustion behind her bright blue eyes. "Junie," he said slowly, "did you eat today?" She shook her head. "This morning I found cookies behind a bakery." She paused for a moment, then added honestly, "in the trash." Silas stood up so quickly the bench creaked behind him. The thought of a child digging through garbage for food made his stomach twist with anger and shame. Junie flinched, worried. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," Silas said immediately, forcing calm into his voice. He extended his hand toward her. "You didn't do anything wrong." Junie looked at his hand cautiously, unsure. "Where are we going?" she asked in a small voice. Silas took a steady breath. In that moment, the decision felt simple and undeniable. "First," he said, "we're going to get you something to eat." He hesitated for just a second before adding the words that surprised even him. "And today, I'll be your dad just for tonight." Junie's eyes widened with quiet wonder. Junie stared at Silas as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. The park noises returned slowly around them, the rustling trees, the distant laughter of children, but for her everything seemed to pause. "Really?" she asked quietly. The word carried a mixture of hope and disbelief that made Silas's chest tighten. He nodded and kept his hand extended. "Really? First we eat." Junie hesitated only a moment before sliding her small hand into his. Her fingers were cold and light, like she wasn't used to holding on to anyone for long. They walked together along the park path, Junie glancing around with wide curiosity at everything they passed. Dogs pulling on leashes, children racing across the grass, a man blowing giant soap bubbles that floated like tiny planets in the sunlight. Despite everything she had been through, the world still seemed new to her. When they reached the corner diner just outside the park, warm yellow light spilled through the windows. The smell of burgers and fries drifted into the street. Junie slowed, staring through the glass, like she was looking at something magical. "It's pretty," she whispered. Silas opened the door and guided her inside. They slid into a booth near the window, and Junie knelt on the seat so she could see the table properly. A small vase with a plastic daisy stood in the center. Junie studied it with wonder. "There are flowers," she said softly, as if restaurants always having flowers was the most beautiful discovery in the world. The waiter handed them menus, and Junie flipped through the pages carefully, even though she clearly couldn't read the words. "Can I order anything?" she asked, glancing up at Silas with cautious excitement. Silas smiled gently. "Anything you want." Junie pointed to a picture of a hamburger with fries. Then she looked at him again, worried she might be asking too much. "And chocolate milk," she added in a small voice. Silas nodded without hesitation. "Chocolate milk is perfect." Junie's smile spread across her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. The food arrived a few minutes later, and Junie's eyes widened as if the plate in front of her was something rare and wonderful. The hamburger looked enormous in her small hands. For a moment, she simply stared at it, almost afraid to touch it. Then she glanced at Silas, seeking silent permission. "Go ahead," he said gently. Junie took a bite. Her expression changed instantly, surprise, relief, happiness all at once. She chewed slowly, savoring the taste as if she wanted the moment to last forever. A little ketchup smudged the corner of her mouth, but she didn't notice. Silas watched quietly, feeling something warm and painful rise inside his chest. No child should look this grateful for something as simple as a meal. Junie ate carefully, switching between the burger and the fries, occasionally taking small sips of her chocolate milk, like it was a special treat. After a few bites, she looked up at him with curiosity. "Silas," she said. "Yeah, are you a real dad?" The question caught him off guard. He paused, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't taken a sip yet. "I am," he answered slowly. "I have a daughter. Her name is Maeve." Junie's blue eyes brightened with interest. "How old is she? 9? Junie nodded thoughtfully. "Is she nice?" Silas felt a small smile appear. "Very." Junie studied him for a moment, then asked the question that made his chest tighten again. "Where is she now?" Silas looked down at the table, avoiding her eyes for a second. "She lives with her mom." Junie tilted her head slightly. "Do you miss her?" Silas didn't hesitate this time. "Every day." Junie looked at him quietly, then nodded as if she understood something important. "I miss my mom every day too," she said softly. For a moment, the busy diner faded away around them, leaving only two people sharing the same kind of empty space in their hearts. Junie finished the last of her fries slowly, almost carefully, as if she were stretching the moment so it wouldn't end too soon. The empty plate in front of her looked like proof of something important, something warm and safe that she hadn't felt in a long time. Silas watched her wipe her fingers with a paper napkin, the way she tried to be neat despite the hunger that had clearly followed her for days. Outside the diner window, the afternoon sun was beginning to fade into a softer golden light. Families walked past the glass, holding balloons and ice cream cones, still celebrating Father's Day. Silas leaned back slightly. In the Junie, he said gently, "Do you remember where you were when you were a little girl?" "Junie," he said gently, "do you remember where you used to live with your mom?" Junie tilted her head and thought for a moment. "A small apartment," she said. "It had a yellow door." She paused, her eyes drifting toward the window as if the memory were far away. "But we had to leave when she got sick. We stayed in different places after that." Silas's chest tightened again. "Did anyone help you?" Junie shrugged. Sometimes people gave us food. One lady gave my mom soup. Her voice softened. Mom said the world still had kind people. Silas swallowed hard. The simplicity of those words felt like a quiet challenge. After a moment, Junie looked back at him. Silas, are you really going to be my dad tonight? She asked carefully. Silas felt the weight of that promise settle deeper inside him. He had meant it as comfort, a small kindness for a child who had clearly been alone too long. But hearing her ask it again made the moment feel bigger than he expected. Yes, he said softly. Tonight you don't have to worry about anything. Junie's shoulders relaxed a little, as if those words lifted something heavy off her small frame. She took one last sip of her chocolate milk and smiled at him with shy gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Silas nodded, but inside his heart something had already begun to shift. What had started as one simple meal for a hungry child was quietly turning into something else, something that felt a lot like responsibility. When the waiter brought the bill, Silas stood and reached for his coat. Junie slid carefully out of the booth and looked up at him. Where do we go now? She asked. Silas hesitated only a second before answering. Home. The word surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. Junie stood very still when Silas said the word home, as if she were trying to understand whether it meant what she hoped it meant. Her small fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the booth before she slowly looked up at him. You're home, she asked carefully. Silas nodded. Just for tonight, he said gently, not wanting to promise more than he could yet explain. Junie's eyes widened with quiet wonder. She had heard the word home many times in the past months, but it had always meant somewhere temporary. Some bench, some stairwell, some place warm enough to sleep until morning. The idea that someone might invite her into a real house felt almost impossible. They stepped out of the diner into the cool evening air. The sky over Chicago had begun turning shades of pink and gold, and the streetlights flickered on one by one along the sidewalk. Junie walked beside Silas, glancing up at the tall buildings around them, like they were mountains made of glass. When a sleek black car rolled to the curb in front of them, she stopped walking. Is that yours? She asked softly. Silas opened the door and nodded. It's just a car, he said with a small smile. But to Junie it looked like something out of a movie. She climbed into the seat, carefully touching the soft leather with cautious fingers. It's so clean, she whispered, almost afraid she might accidentally make it dirty. Silas sat beside her and gave the driver a quiet instruction. As the car moved through the city streets, Junie pressed her face lightly against the window, watching the glowing buildings and bright storefronts rush past. Everything seemed big and bright and full of life. Chicago is beautiful at night, she murmured. Silas followed her gaze, suddenly seeing the city through new eyes, eyes that noticed simple things he had stopped seeing years ago. After a few minutes, Junie looked back at him. Silas, yeah. When I wake up tomorrow, will I still be here? The question was so small and hopeful, it made his chest ache. Silas paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. Tomorrow, he said softly, we'll figure things out together. Junie nodded slowly and leaned back into the seat, her eyelids growing heavy. For the first time in a long while, she looked like a child who felt safe enough to fall asleep. The car glided through the quiet evening streets of Chicago, its headlights tracing long ribbons of light across the pavement. Inside the city, noise faded into a soft hum, replaced by the gentle rhythm of the engine. Junie had curled slightly into the corner of the seat, her small head resting against the window. Within minutes, sleep claimed her completely. Silas glanced over and noticed how peaceful she looked, now that exhaustion had finally caught up with her. A strand of blonde hair had fallen across her face, and her breathing was slow and steady, the way children sleep when they feel safe. Carefully, he reached over and adjusted the corner of his coat across her shoulders like a blanket. The driver slowed the car as they turned onto a quieter street, lined with elegant townhouses and glowing porch lights. Silas watched Junie for a moment longer, feeling a strange mixture of emotions rise in his chest. He had spent years building a life defined by control-structured meetings, calculated risks, precise decisions. Yet somehow the most unexpected decision of his day had happened on a park bench with a hungry 6-year-old holding a crumpled drawing. The car stopped in front of his townhouse, a tall brick building with warm lights glowing behind the windows. Silas stepped out first, and then gently lifted Junie into his arms. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake her small hand instinctively gripping the fabric of his coat. For a brief moment, the feeling brought back a memory so vivid it almost stopped his breath. Maeve at 3 years old falling asleep on his shoulder after long afternoons at the park. He pushed the memory aside and carried Junie up the front steps. Inside the house was quiet and spotless, the kind of silence that expensive homes often hold when no one truly lives in them. Silas set Junie carefully on the couch and turned on a soft lamp nearby. The warm light filled the room slowly. Junie blinked awake, confused for a second before her eyes adjusted. She looked around the large living room with wide wonder. "This is your home," she whispered. Silas nodded. Junie sat up slowly, taking in the tall ceilings, the polished floors, and the large windows overlooking the city lights. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she looked back at him and smiled shyly. "It feels warm here," she said. Silas realized something in that moment. The house had always been beautiful. Tonight, for the first time, it actually felt like a place where someone might belong. Junie slowly slid off the couch and stood in the middle of the living room, turning in a small circle as she tried to take everything in. The tall windows revealed a glittering view of Chicago's night skyline, and the soft golden lights inside the house made the polished wooden floor glow warmly. For a child who had spent nights on park benches and under bridges, the place must have felt like a palace. She stepped forward carefully, as if she were afraid something might break beneath her shoes. "Your house is really big," she whispered. Silas gave a small smile. "Sometimes it feels too big." Junie looked at him curiously, not fully understanding what he meant. To her, big meant safe, warm, and full of possibilities. She wandered toward the wide staircase and gently touched the smooth railing with her fingertips. "Do you live here all by yourself?" she asked. Silas leaned against the back of a chair for a moment before answering. "Most of the time, yes." Junie thought about that quietly, then nodded as if she understood loneliness better than most children her age. A moment later, her stomach made a small noise, and she quickly covered it with both hands, embarrassed. Silas chuckled softly. Still hungry, Junie shrugged with a shy grin. "Maybe a little." Silas walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The shelves were full, but strangely impersonal containers prepared by staff, neatly labeled meals, things designed for convenience rather than comfort. He grabbed a carton of milk and some fresh strawberries. When he placed the bowl in front of Junie at the kitchen island, she looked at it like it was another small miracle. "Strawberries," she said with delight. She took one carefully and bit into it, juice brightening her tired face. For a moment, the room felt lighter. As she ate, Junie glanced around again. "Silas," she asked between bites. "Yeah. Where will I sleep tonight?" The question was simple, but it carried the uncertainty of a child who had learned not to expect too much. Silas paused for a second, then gestured toward the hallway. "There's a guest room upstairs." Junie's eyes widened again. "A whole room?" she asked softly. Silas nodded. Junie smiled in amazement, as if the idea of having a room just for one night felt like the greatest gift in the world. Junie followed Silas up the wide staircase slowly, her small hand sliding along the polished wooden railing, as if she were exploring a museum instead of a house. Every few steps, she paused to look around her eyes, reflecting the warm lights that lined the hallway above. The second floor opened into a quiet corridor with several closed doors, thick carpets muffling their footsteps. For Silas, the hallway had always felt ordinary, just another part of the townhouse he rarely thought about. But seeing Junie walk through it with such careful curiosity made the place feel completely different. He stopped in front of a door and gently pushed it open. "This will be your room tonight," he said. Junie stepped inside and froze. The guest room was simple but comfortable, a soft bed with white blankets, a small lamp on the bedside table, and a wide window looking out over the glowing city skyline. To Silas, it was nothing special. To Junie, it looked like something from a dream. She walked slowly to the bed and pressed her hand into the blanket, testing the softness. "It's so fluffy," she whispered, amazed. Silas leaned against the doorway, watching her reaction quietly. Something about the moment tugged at him again, the realization that the smallest comforts in his world could mean everything to someone else. Junie turned toward him suddenly. "Silas, yeah, are you sure I can sleep here?" she asked. Her voice held the careful tone of someone who had been turned away too many times before. Silas nodded without hesitation. "Of course. This room is yours tonight." Junie climbed onto the bed cautiously and sat near the edge, still looking around like she expected someone to come in and say there had been a mistake. After a moment, she lay back against the pillows, her eyes widening even more. "It feels like sleeping on clouds," she murmured. Silas couldn't help smiling at that. He stepped further into the room and placed a folded towel and a clean t-shirt on the chair nearby. "You can change into this if you want," he said. Junie sat up again and hugged the soft blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered sincerely. As Silas turned off the main light and left only the small lamp glowing, he paused at the door. Junie was already curling up under the blankets, her tired eyes slowly closing. For the first time in months, the quiet house felt less empty, and Silas realized that one unexpected guest had already changed the way the whole place felt. Morning sunlight slipped quietly through the tall window, painting soft gold lines across the guest room. Junie stirred beneath the thick white blanket, blinking slowly, as if she needed a moment to remember where she was. For a second, she stayed very still, listening. The house was silent, but not the lonely silence she knew from sleeping under bridges or on park benches. This silence felt calm, safe. She pushed herself up carefully and looked around the room again, almost checking to see if the night before had been a dream. The fluffy bed, the warm lamp, the clean shirt folded neatly on the chair, everything was still there. Junie smiled to herself. She slipped out of bed and padded softly to the doorway. The hallway outside was quiet, filled with gentle morning light. Following the faint sound of movement downstairs, she walked carefully down the staircase. In the kitchen, Silas stood near the counter, pouring coffee into a mug while scanning a few emails on his phone. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and paused. Junie stood at the bottom of the stairs, wearing the oversized t-shirt he had left for her. It hung nearly to her knees, and her messy blonde hair stuck out in sleepy directions. For a brief second, the sight caught Silas off guard, because it reminded him painfully of mornings years ago when Maeve used to wander into the kitchen the exact same way. "Good morning," Junie said shyly. Silas set his phone aside immediately. "Morning, Junie." She stepped closer, glancing around the bright kitchen again. The smell of toast filled the air. "Did I really sleep here?" she asked softly, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. Silas smiled. "You did." Junie climbed onto one of the tall stools by the kitchen island and watched him with curious eyes. "What are we doing today?" she asked. The question seemed simple, but it made Silas pause. His life was usually planned weeks ahead, meetings, flights, schedules mapped out to the hour. Yet standing there that morning, looking at the small, hopeful child sitting at his kitchen counter, the idea of planning felt strangely different. He grabbed 2 plates and placed toast and scrambled eggs in front of her. "Today," he said thoughtfully, "we start figuring things out." Junie took a bite of toast and nodded seriously, like she had just been invited into something very important. Junie ate her breakfast slowly, taking careful bites of toast, as if she were still learning the rhythm of having a real meal at a table. The morning sunlight filled the kitchen, reflecting softly off the marble countertop and turning the room warm and bright. Silas leaned against the counter with his coffee, watching her with quiet thoughtfulness. For years, his mornings had been rushed, emails, meetings, phone calls before the day had even begun. But today, the house felt different, slower somehow. After a few minutes, Junie looked up from her plate. Silas, yeah. Do kids usually eat breakfast like this every day? She asked honestly. Silas blinked for a second. Most kids do, he said gently. Junie nodded, absorbing that information like it was something new about the world. My mom used to make oatmeal when we had a stove, she said. She put cinnamon on top. It smelled really nice. Her voice softened at the memory. Silas felt the familiar tug in his chest again. She sounds like she was a good mom. Junie smiled faintly. She was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Silas cleared his throat and pulled out a chair across from her. Junie, he began carefully. There are some things we should talk about today. Junie's expression grew attentive. She wiped her fingers on a napkin and sat up straighter, as if she understood the conversation might be important, like what she asked. Silas chose his words slowly. You shouldn't be out there on your own. Kids need a safe place, school people who can take care of them. Junie looked down at the table quietly. I know, she said after a moment, but I didn't know where else to go. The honesty in her voice made Silas pause again. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, considering something that had begun forming in his mind since the night before. Maybe, he said slowly, we can find a way to change that. Junie looked up with cautious hope in her eyes. You mean, I could stay here? She asked. Silas didn't answer immediately. He knew the situation was more complicated than that. There were rules, social services, things that had to be done properly. But when he looked at her hopeful face, the answer in his heart felt surprisingly clear. Let's just say, he said gently, we're going to figure out a better future for you. Junie nodded slowly, holding on to that promise like it was the beginning of something new. Junie finished the last bite of her toast and sat quietly for a moment, her small fingers tracing invisible circles on the smooth surface of the kitchen counter. The sunlight had grown brighter now, filling the room with warmth. Silas rinsed the dishes in the sink, but his mind was far away, turning over questions he hadn't expected to face when he woke up that morning. Eventually, he dried his hands and turned back toward her. Junie, he said gently, there's someone we should talk to today. People whose job is to help kids who don't have families taking care of them. Junie's shoulders stiffened slightly. Her hopeful expression faded into something cautious. You mean people who take kids away? She asked quietly. Silas noticed the fear in her voice immediately. He walked back to the island and crouched slightly so they were at eye level. No one is taking you away today, he said calmly. But there are rules that help make sure kids are safe. Junie looked down at her hands again. Sometimes the rules don't feel very safe, she murmured. The words carried more experience than a 6-year-old should have. Silas felt a small ache in his chest hearing that. He understood that whatever Junie had gone through over the past months had taught her not to trust the system easily. I promise, he said softly. If we talk to anyone, I'll be right there with you. Junie studied his face carefully, searching for any sign that he might change his mind later. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Okay. Silas stood again and glanced toward the large window overlooking the city. The day outside was already busy, cars moving through the streets, people rushing toward their own schedules. But inside the house, everything felt strangely different now. For the first time in years, Silas's plans for the day weren't about business deals or board meetings. They were about making sure one small girl would never have to sleep on a park bench again. Silas grabbed his phone from the counter, staring at the screen for a moment, before unlocking it. Normally, the first thing he did every morning was scan through dozens of messages from his assistant partners and investors. Today, the notifications felt strangely unimportant. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Junie watched him quietly from the stool, her feet swinging slowly back and forth beneath the counter. "Who are you calling?" she asked. Silas glanced up briefly. "A friend who knows how to help in situations like this." Junie nodded, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. Silas stepped toward the window and dialed. After a few rings, a woman answered. "Clara Whitfield speaking." "Clara, it's Silas Mercer." There was a pause, then her voice brightened with surprise. "Silas, I didn't expect to hear from you this early." Clara Whitfield was a family attorney who had worked with him on several legal matters over the years, but she was also known for her work with child welfare cases. If anyone could guide him through this situation properly, it was her. "I need some advice," Silas said. His tone grew more serious. "It's about a child." Clara's voice shifted immediately into professional focus. "Is the child safe right now?" Silas looked across the kitchen at Junie. She was nibbling on the last strawberry from the bowl, completely unaware that her future might be starting to change. "Yes," he answered firmly. "She's safe." "Good," Clara said. "Tell me what's going on." Silas explained briefly how he had met Junie in the park, how she had been living alone since her mother passed away, and how she had nowhere else to go. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Silas, situations like this are delicate, but if what you're telling me is accurate, the most important thing right now is making sure the child is protected." Silas glanced back at Junie again. She looked up and gave him a small, trusting smile. "That's exactly what I want to do," he said quietly. Silas ended the call, slowly lowering the phone as Clara's final words echoed in his mind. She had promised to come by later that afternoon to help him figure out the right steps, contacting the proper agencies, confirming Junie's situation, and making sure everything was done legally. It was the responsible path, the logical one. Yet standing there in the bright kitchen, Silas realized something else had already taken root inside him. This wasn't just about helping a child for a day. Junie was sitting at the counter humming softly to herself, while she lined up the green leaves from the strawberries like tiny decorations. When she noticed him looking at her, she smiled. "Are we going somewhere today?" she asked. Silas walked back toward the island and rested his hands on the counter. "A friend of mine is coming to talk with us later," he said gently. "She helps kids and families figure out what to do when things get complicated." Junie tilted her head slightly. "Is she nice?" Silas nodded. "Very." Junie seemed satisfied with that answer. She hopped down from the stool and wandered toward the living room windows, pressing her hands against the glass as she stared out at the busy city below. Cars moved like tiny toys on the street far beneath them. "It's so high up," she whispered in amazement. Silas watched her quietly from across the room. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like a place built only for quiet success and empty evenings. There was movement now, curiosity, small footsteps echoing through the halls. Junie turned back toward him suddenly. "Silas, if your friend says I can't stay, will I have to go back to the park?" The question landed heavier than anything she had said all morning. Silas took a slow breath before answering. "No," he said firmly. "You won't be alone again." Junie studied his face for a moment, then nodded with quiet relief, trusting the promise more than she understood the future. The late morning passed more quietly than Silas expected. Instead of the usual rush of calls and meetings, the house filled with small, simple moments that felt strangely important. Junie wandered through the living room with wide curiosity, pausing to study everything, like it was part of an adventure. She traced the edge of a tall bookshelf with her fingers, examined the glossy photos on the walls, and spent nearly 10 minutes staring at the city skyline through the giant window. "Do all people live this high?" she asked at one point. Silas chuckled softly. "Not most." Junie nodded thoughtfully, as if she was collecting facts about a world she had never seen before. Eventually, she found a small, decorative globe sitting on a shelf near the couch. She spun it carefully, watching the blue oceans blur into color. "The world is really big," she whispered. Silas watched her from across the room, leaning against the doorway. Something about the quiet innocence of the moment pulled at him again. Junie had spent months worrying about food and safe places to sleep, yet she still had the curiosity of a child who believed the world held wonders. That thought made him both hopeful and painfully aware of how easily that curiosity could have been lost. After a while, Junie wandered into the kitchen again. "Silas, yeah. Can I draw something?" she asked. Silas raised an eyebrow slightly. "Of course." He grabbed a notepad and a pen from the counter and placed them in front of her. Junie climbed back onto the stool and began sketching with intense concentration. Her small tongue peeked out the corner of her mouth as she worked. Silas watched quietly while she drew curved lines and uneven shapes across the paper. After several minutes, she pushed the page toward him proudly. It was a simple drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a large sun. One figure was tall, the other 2 were small. Above them, she had written 3 words in shaky letters: a family. Silas stared at the drawing longer than he expected. Something in his chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't just sadness. Junie looked up at him, hopeful. "Do you like it?" she asked. Silas nodded slowly, his voice softer than before. "Yeah," he said. "I really do." Silas kept looking at the drawing long after Junie had pushed it across the counter. The paper was simple, just uneven stick figures and a bright sun in the corner. But the meaning behind it felt unexpectedly heavy. One tall figure in the middle, 2 small ones on either side, their hands connected by thin pencil lines. Above them, in shaky letters that leaned in different directions, Junie had written, "A family." Silas swallowed quietly. "Who are they?" he asked gently. Junie leaned forward, pointing at the drawing with excitement. "That one is you," she said, tapping the tall stick figure. Then she tapped the smaller one beside it. "That's me." Her finger moved to the second small figure. "And that one can be your other daughter." Silas felt a small ache bloom in his chest at the mention of Maeve. He nodded slowly. "You remembered her." Junie smiled. "You said she was 9 and very nice." Silas studied the paper again, imagining Maeve's face for a moment, the way her brown hair used to bounce when she laughed, the way she used to tug on his sleeve to show him drawings from school. He hadn't seen her in months. The thought left a quiet emptiness in the room. Junie noticed the shift in his expression. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly. Silas shook his head quickly. "No, Junie. Not at all." He slid the drawing carefully across the counter toward himself, almost like it was something fragile. "It's actually one of the nicest drawings anyone's ever given me." Junie's shoulders relaxed again. She watched him thoughtfully for a moment before asking another question. "Do you think your daughter would like me?" Silas hesitated. The truth was complicated. Maeve had been hurt by his absence, and bringing another child into the picture might not be easy for her to understand. But looking at Junie's hopeful face, he knew honesty and kindness had to walk together. "I think," he said slowly, "it might take time. But Maeve has a very good heart." Junie nodded as if that answer made sense. Just then, the quiet chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. Silas glanced toward the hallway. "That must be my friend," he said. Junie's eyes widened slightly with curiosity and a little nervousness. The moment that would help decide what came next had just arrived. Silas opened the door, a woman in her 30s, with a short bob haircut and a pair of glasses. She was wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. She had a small dog with her. The dog was a small black and white terrier. The woman smiled at Silas and said, "Hello, I'm your new neighbor." Silas smiled back and said, "Hi, I'm Silas." The woman nodded and said, "I'm your new neighbor, too." Silas nodded back and said, "Nice to meet you." The woman smiled and said, "Nice to meet you, too." Silas and the woman shook hands and said goodbye. Silas walked toward the front door, while Junie remained near the kitchen island watching nervously from a distance. The soft echo of the doorbell still lingered through the quiet house. When Silas opened the door, a woman in her mid-40s stood on the porch, holding a leather briefcase. She had calm gray eyes, dark hair pulled neatly into a low bun, and the kind of steady expression that made people feel they could trust her immediately. "Silas," she said, with a warm but professional smile. "Clara, thanks for coming." Silas stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. As Clara walked inside, her eyes naturally scanned the room, an instinct from years of working with families and children in complicated situations. Then she noticed the small blonde girl standing near the counter, holding the edge of the notepad she had been drawing on. Clara softened instantly. "You must be Junie," she said gently. Junie looked at Silas first, making sure it was okay to answer. When he nodded reassuringly, she stepped forward a little. "Hi," she said quietly. Clara crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Hi, Junie. I'm Clara." Junie studied her face carefully, just like she had studied Silas's the day before. Children who had learned to rely on themselves often looked for signs of kindness before trusting someone new. Clara noticed the cautious curiosity and offered a small, reassuring smile. "Silas told me you like drawing," she said, glancing at the notepad in Junie's hands. Junie nodded and slowly showed her the page with the stick figure family. Clara examined it with genuine interest. "That's a beautiful picture," she said sincerely. Junie looked pleased but still shy. Silas watched the exchange, quietly relieved that Clara's calm presence seemed to put Junie at ease. After a moment, Clara stood again and turned toward him. "Why don't we all sit down and talk for a bit?" she suggested. They moved to the living room, where the afternoon sunlight filled the space with warm light. Junie sat on the couch, swinging her legs nervously, while Clara opened her briefcase. For the first time since she arrived, Clara's voice grew slightly more serious. "Junie," she said gently, "I'm going to ask a few questions so we can understand how to help you best. Is that okay?" Junie glanced at Silas again. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. She took a quiet breath and answered softly, "Okay." Junie sat very still on the edge of the couch, her small hands folded together in her lap, while Clara opened a slim notebook from her briefcase. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of traffic from the street far below. Clara kept her voice calm and warm, careful not to make the moment feel like an interrogation. "Junie," she began gently, "can you tell me your mom's name?" Junie looked down at her fingers for a second before answering. "Her name was Lily Hart." Clara nodded and wrote it down. "And how old are you?" "6," Junie replied. Clara continued with slow, simple questions: where Junie and her mother had last lived, how long her mother had been sick, whether Junie remembered any relatives or family friends. Junie tried her best to answer, though sometimes she paused, searching her memory for details that had grown blurry over time. Silas sat quietly in a chair nearby, listening to the conversation with growing heaviness in his chest. Each answer confirmed what he had already feared: Junie had truly been alone for months. When the questions finally slowed, Clara closed her notebook thoughtfully. She looked at Junie first, her voice soft again. "You've been very brave," she said kindly. Junie blinked at the compliment, unsure how to respond. Then Clara turned to Silas. Her expression was serious, but not discouraging. "Based on what we've heard," she said, "Junie will need temporary guardianship while the authorities confirm her situation and search for any remaining relatives." Silas leaned forward slightly. "And what does that mean?" Clara held his gaze. It means someone responsible needs to care for her during that process. There was a brief silence before she added gently, "That person could be you." Junie looked between them, not fully understanding the legal words, but sensing that something important had just been said. "Does that mean I can stay here?" she asked quietly. Silas didn't hesitate this time. He met Clara's eyes for a second, then looked back at Junie and nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "It means you can stay." Junie's face slowly lit up with relief and wonder, like a child who had just heard the beginning of a story where things might finally turn out okay. Junie sat quietly on the couch for a moment, after Silas spoke, as if she needed time to fully understand what his words meant. The room felt warmer, suddenly filled with a quiet sense of possibility. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "So, I don't have to go back to the park?" she asked softly. Silas shook his head immediately. "No, Junie, you don't." The relief that spread across her small face was impossible to miss. She slid off the couch and walked toward him slowly, almost cautiously, like she was afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she reached him, she wrapped her arms around his waist in a sudden tight hug. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that Silas froze for a second before gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Clara watched the moment quietly from across the room, a small knowing smile on her face. After a moment, Junie stepped back and looked up at Silas again. "Does that mean you're really my dad now?" she asked. Silas crouched slightly so they were eye level. "It means I'm going to take care of you," he said carefully. "And we'll see where the future leads." Junie considered that answer for a moment, then nodded with quiet satisfaction. For her, that promise was already enough. She ran back to the kitchen island, grabbed the drawing she had made earlier, and returned with it. "Then this can stay here," she said proudly, handing him the paper again. Silas looked down at the drawing of the 3 stick figures holding hands beneath the bright sun. For the first time in a long while, the idea of a family didn't feel like something he had lost forever. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows of the once silent house, the drawing rested in his hands like the beginning of a new chapter. One neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. Did this story touch your heart? Let us know how you felt. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments below. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss our next heartfelt story. Click the end screen to watch more emotional journeys. See you in the next one.